Mark Hensley was the kind of cop who could read guilt in a heartbeat until the night he saw it staring back at him from his own son's eyes. Detective Mark Hensley had built a reputation in the small town of Brookdale as the kind of cop people trusted without question. He was calm under pressure, methodical in his work, and known for his quiet compassion. Over the years, his name had become synonymous with safety. If there was a break-in, Mark was the one neighbors called first. If a child went missing, he was already out searching before the official alert went out. He wasn't just a police officer, he was part of the heartbeat of the town. Mark's life seemed to mirror his work: steady, responsible, unshakable. He lived in a tidy house on the edge of Brookdale with his wife, Laura, and their teenage son, Tyler. To outsiders, the Hensleys were a model family. Mark mowed the lawn every Sunday morning, Laura baked pies for the annual fair, and Tyler, though quiet and reserved, was polite to everyone. They were the family people pointed to when they said small-town life still had good people in it. For Mark, the best part of each day came after his shift. He'd pull into the driveway, the scent of pine and cut grass drifting through the open window, and see his wife's light still on in the kitchen. Tyler would usually be in his room, headphones on, sketching or working on some project he never talked much about. Mark figured it was normal teenage behavior. Kids needed space to grow. He'd always been a believer in letting his son find his own rhythm as long as he stayed out of trouble. But lately, there had been something different about the town. The first sign came quietly: a missing pet poster taped to a telephone pole near the grocery store. Then another appeared a few days later, and another. At first, everyone assumed it was coyotes. Brookdale bordered a thick stretch of woods, and wildlife sightings weren't unusual. But the pattern didn't fit. The animals weren't disappearing near the forest. They were vanishing from fenced backyards, from porches, even from locked sheds. As the days passed, whispers began to spread. People started looking over their shoulders, keeping their pets inside, locking their gates. The police department opened a small investigation, more as a gesture of comfort than out of genuine concern. Missing animals didn't usually make front-page news. Still, Mark found himself strangely drawn to the case. Something about it gnawed at him. The locations were all too familiar, just a few blocks from his own home. One evening, while reviewing reports at his desk, he traced the points of each disappearance on a map. A cold feeling settled in his stomach when he realized the center of the cluster sat almost exactly where his neighborhood was. It wasn't proof of anything, but it unsettled him enough that he decided to walk the area that night after work. The streets were quiet, the yellow glow of porch lights flickering across trimmed lawns. Mark's shoes crunched softly against the gravel as he passed the Petersons' house, where a golden retriever had vanished the week before. He noticed how peaceful everything looked, how deceivingly normal. Yet under that calm surface, he sensed tension. The town he'd protected for 2 decades suddenly felt different, as if a hidden current of fear was running beneath it. When he returned home, Laura was asleep on the couch, the TV murmuring in the background. Tyler's light was still on upstairs. Mark hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, wondering whether to check in on him, but he told himself not to worry. Tyler had always been a bit of an introvert, more interested in sketchbooks and computers than hanging out with friends. It was harmless. Still, as Mark turned off the lights and locked the doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting around him. The missing pets, the strange silence in the neighborhood, the uneasy weight in his chest, it all pointed to something he couldn't yet see. And for the first time in his career, he had no idea where to start looking. What he didn't know was that the answer wasn't out there in the woods or down the street. It was already much closer, just behind one closed bedroom door upstairs, waiting for him to find it. Mark woke early the next morning with a lingering sense of unease that he couldn't explain. The air felt heavy inside the house, as though something unseen was pressing against the walls. He tried to push the thought aside, telling himself he was just tired. Another long week on the job could make anyone jumpy. Still, as he poured his coffee and glanced out the window toward the backyard, that same uneasy chill crept up his spine. The neighborhood was still, almost too still, as if waiting for something to happen. That afternoon, Mark got home earlier than usual. Laura had gone to visit her sister, and Tyler was at school. He decided to fix a loose light in the basement, a small job he had been putting off. As he descended the stairs, the air grew colder and damp. The faint scent of dust and something metallic filled the room. It wasn't unusual for basements to smell like that, but today it felt sharper, stronger. His flashlight beams swept across boxes, tools, and shelves, landing on a small wooden box tucked beneath the old workbench. He frowned, crouched down, and pulled it out. The box was heavier than it looked and locked with a small latch. It wasn't familiar. Mark knew every inch of his home, yet he had never seen this box before. He turned it over, inspecting the sides, trying to remember if maybe he had bought it years ago and forgotten. But no, this wasn't his. A faint unease stirred in his chest. He placed it on the workbench, staring at it for a long time before deciding to open it. Years of police work had trained him to follow his instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed that something was wrong. He went upstairs, found a small universal key from his desk, and came back down. The key clicked easily, and the box opened with a soft creak. Inside, he found several small animal collars neatly arranged in rows. Each one had a name tag: Buddy, Mittens, Rex, and others he recognized from the missing posters he'd seen around town. His hands trembled slightly as he picked one up. The metal was cold against his palm, the engraved letters catching the dim light. There were 10 collars in total, 10 pets that families had been searching for. He stared at them for a long time, his heartbeat growing louder in the silence. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had brought these to Tyler. Maybe they were from the lost and found at the park. Tyler was known to wander around with his camera, sometimes taking pictures of stray animals. But even as Mark tried to reason it out, something didn't fit. These collars weren't dirty or torn, they were carefully cleaned and arranged, as if someone had been collecting them on purpose. A memory flickered in his mind how Tyler had once asked odd questions about how long it took for someone to notice when a pet went missing, whether police really kept track of those reports. At the time, Mark had brushed it off as curiosity. Teenagers asked strange things sometimes. But now, the thought clung to him like a shadow. He closed the box and put it back under the bench, his hands slightly unsteady. The air in the basement seemed heavier now, the silence pressing against his ears. When he went back upstairs, the normal sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator felt unfamiliar, distant. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, lost in thought. That evening, Tyler came home, heading straight to his room without a word. Mark watched him from the hallway, the image of the box flashing through his mind. He wanted to ask about it, but couldn't bring himself to do it. What if he was wrong? What if there was an innocent reason? Yet a deep part of him, the part that had guided him through years of police work, whispered that he wasn't wrong at all. Something was happening inside his own home, something that didn't belong in the quiet, ordinary life he'd built. As the house settled into silence that night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards made his muscles tense. Somewhere in the darkness below, the wooden box sat untouched beneath the bench, holding secrets that would soon unravel everything he believed about his family. Sleep came and went in fragments for Mark that night. He drifted in and out of uneasy dreams filled with faint scratching sounds and flickering lights. When he finally sat up, the clock read a little past midnight. The house was silent, but something about that silence felt unnatural, as though it was holding its breath. He listened carefully, waiting. Then, from upstairs, came the soft creak of floorboards, slow and deliberate. Someone was moving around. Mark reached for the habit of years on the force: stay calm, stay quiet, observe before acting. He slipped on his slippers and crept toward the stairs, keeping to the shadows. The faint glow of a flashlight flickered across the hallway, bouncing lightly off the walls. It was coming from Tyler's room. Mark froze halfway up the stairs, his pulse thudding in his ears. Tyler's door opened slowly, and his son stepped out, holding the flashlight and something else, a small ring of keys. He didn't look toward his father, he moved quietly toward the basement. Mark stayed still, every instinct telling him not to interrupt, not yet. He watched as Tyler unlocked the basement door and disappeared down the steps. After a long minute, Mark followed, careful not to make a sound. The air grew colder as he descended, the faint hum of the furnace the only noise. From the shadows at the bottom of the stairs, he could see Tyler's flashlight beam moving around the room, landing on that same wooden box. But Tyler didn't open it. Instead, he turned toward a section of the basement wall that looked slightly different from the rest, a wooden panel with a padlock. Mark's stomach tightened. He had never noticed that panel before. He'd been down here countless times over the years, and yet somehow this section had escaped his attention. Tyler knelt, unlocked the padlock with one of the keys, and swung the panel open. For a moment, Mark could see what looked like a narrow cabinet built into the wall. Tyler reached inside, lifted out a stack of something wrapped in old newspaper, then turned off the flashlight and left the basement as quietly as he'd entered. Mark waited until he was sure Tyler was gone before moving closer. His hands felt cold as he reached for the same panel. The padlock was old and scratched, but the door swung open easily. The small cabinet inside was lined with metal shelving, the kind used in workshops. Several more stacks of newspaper-wrapped bundles set neatly inside. Mark pulled one out, unwrapped it slowly, and felt his breath catch. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. They showed animals, first dogs, cats, even birds, each one positioned as though someone had taken deliberate, staged pictures. Mark's throat tightened as he flipped through the stack, his fingers trembling. Then the photos changed. They were no longer animals, but people, neighbors, classmates, families around town. Some were taken from a distance, others through windows, all of them unaware they were being watched. At the bottom of the pile, he found one image that froze him completely. It was the photo of a young woman walking along a dimly lit street. Her name was Emma Lawson, and she had been missing for 2 months. Mark had been the lead investigator on her case. Her photo still hung on the bulletin board at the station, pinned above a timeline of her last known movements. But here she was, in a photograph hidden in his own basement. The weight of the realization hit him all at once. His breathing grew shallow, his heart pounding in disbelief and horror. He sank against the wall, the photos scattered around him. Everything in his world suddenly felt like it was tilting, collapsing. The quiet, polite boy he had raised, the one who barely spoke, who spent hours in his room, had been hiding something monstrous. Mark gathered the photos quickly and shoved them back into the cabinet, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He locked it and replaced the padlock, his mind spinning. Upstairs, the sound of footsteps crossed the floor again, then the faint creak of Tyler's door closing. He stayed in the basement for a long time, staring at the place where the cabinet met the wall, unable to move. He had spent his entire career finding the truth in other people's homes, digging through lies and secrets. Now that same truth had found him, right beneath his own roof. And as the night stretched on, Mark realized he wasn't just dealing with a mystery anymore, he was living inside one. Mark drove to work the next morning with the weight of the night pressing down on him like a storm cloud. The town rolled past his car window, quiet and familiar, but nothing looked the same anymore. Every house, every face, every pet running across a yard stirred a deep sickness in his stomach. He kept seeing those photographs in his mind, the missing girl, the frightened animals, the strange, empty eyes of his son illuminated by that flashlight in the dark. He wanted to believe there was an explanation, some twisted misunderstanding. But no amount of logic could erase what he had seen. At the station, routine chatter filled the air. Officers discussed minor cases, a few traffic stops, and updates about the ongoing missing person investigation. Emma Lawson's name still floated in the conversation. One officer mentioned a new lead, another said her family had been calling again. Mark just sat at his desk, staring at the files, pretending to read. The edges of the papers blurred as his thoughts drifted. He knew he couldn't tell anyone what he had found. Not yet, not until he understood it himself. By late afternoon, he couldn't stand it any longer. He told the captain he wasn't feeling well and drove home early. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive. Laura was out shopping, and Tyler's school day had ended hours ago. His car was in the driveway. Mark stepped inside and felt the air shift, an almost imperceptible heaviness that made his chest tighten. He called out for his son, but there was no answer. Then he heard a faint clicking sound coming from upstairs. He followed the noise to Tyler's room. The door was unlocked, but only half open. The smell hit him first, a mix of chemicals and something else, something acrid. The curtains were drawn tight, leaving the room dim except for the blue glow of the computer screen. Tyler wasn't there, but the laptop was open on the desk. The clicking came from an external drive connected to it, the small light blinking steadily. Mark hesitated for a long moment, then sat down in the chair. The desktop was clean except for a single folder named Projects. He opened it, and inside were several subfolders labeled by date. He clicked on the most recent one. Dozens of image files appeared, along with a few short video clips. His throat went dry as he opened one at random. The footage was dark and shaky, but clear enough to see what was happening. It showed their basement, the same shelves, the same lighting. And in the corner, a small shape moved, a dog, frightened, tied to a chair. The camera lingered too long, steady and deliberate, as if whoever was filming wanted to capture the fear in every frame. Mark slammed the laptop shut, his pulse racing. His first instinct was to destroy it, to make it vanish before anyone could see. But another voice inside him, one shaped by years of enforcing the law, told him that evidence couldn't be erased. It had to be reported, even if it meant destroying everything he loved. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the closed computer, battling between the father he was and the officer he had sworn to be. When the front door opened downstairs, he nearly jumped out of the chair. Tyler's footsteps echoed through the hallway. Mark's heart pounded as he stood, unsure what to do. For a brief moment, he thought of confronting him, demanding answers, but he couldn't move. His mind was a blur of fear, confusion, and disbelief. Instead, he slipped quietly out of the room, closing the door behind him, and went straight to his own office downstairs. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. The screen reflected his pale face, the lines of exhaustion etched deeper than he'd ever noticed before. He opened the keypad, stared at the numbers, then pressed them one by one. 911. When the dispatcher's voice answered, Mark's throat tightened. The words stuck for a moment before finally coming out, heavy and broken. He identified himself, gave his address, and said there was evidence in his home connected to the missing person investigation. His voice cracked when he said the last part, that it involved someone in his family. He didn't use his son's name. He couldn't bring himself to say it. When he ended the call, he sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Somewhere upstairs, footsteps moved again, slow and steady. The boy he had raised, the one whose laughter used to fill their home, was now a stranger he could no longer protect. And in that moment, Mark knew there was no turning back. Blue and red lights painted the front of the Hensley house as dawn crept across the sky. The flashing reflections stretched across the lawn and into the trees, pulsing like a heartbeat. Neighbors stood at the edges of their driveways in silence, wrapped in coats and confusion, whispering to one another as more patrol cars arrived. For the first time in his life, Mark stood on the wrong side of the flashing lights, watching officers move in and out of his home. Every sound felt distant, the static of radios, the crunch of boots on gravel, the murmured voices of people he had worked beside for decades. He hadn't slept since the call. After speaking to the dispatcher, everything had unfolded quickly, yet in his mind, it all seemed to move in slow motion. The first responders had arrived, and Mark had stepped outside with his hands trembling, barely able to explain what he'd found. He had told them about the photographs, the locked cabinet, and the computer. He hadn't mentioned the wooden box. That secret sat like a stone in his chest, too heavy to speak aloud. Laura arrived soon after, still in her nightgown, confusion clouding her face. She'd been staying with her sister the night before, unaware of what had happened. When she saw the police tape, her voice broke with panic, but no one could tell her what was going on. Mark couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. He just stood near the porch, his shoulders heavy, his badge cold in his pocket. It wasn't long before two detectives approached the door. They were young, faces Mark recognized from the station, faces that once greeted him with respect. Now they avoided his gaze. One of them gently asked where Tyler was. Mark told them he was still upstairs. The words came out hollow, his mouth dry. They moved carefully up the staircase, radios crackling softly. The house that had once felt safe and warm now sounded hollow, every footstep echoing like thunder. Minutes later, the sound of voices drifted down from upstairs, low but urgent. Then came the creak of the stairs as they descended, with Tyler between them. He wasn't fighting, he wasn't crying. He wasn't saying anything at all. His expression was unreadable, neither guilty nor afraid, just empty. His eyes, once curious and bright, looked right past Mark as if he were a stranger on the street. The officers led him outside. Cameras had already arrived by then. Someone had tipped off the local news. Reporters gathered behind the yellow tape, their voices blending into the low hum of morning. Mark turned away as they walked Tyler to the patrol car. The metallic click of the door locking shut echoed in his mind long after the car drove off down the street. Inside, the house was being photographed and searched. Evidence bags piled up on the dining table, camera equipment, hard drives, the wooden box from the basement, and stacks of photographs carefully sealed away. Every corner of his home had become part of a crime scene. Every sound of tearing tape and scribbled notes drove the truth deeper into him. By mid-morning, the chief arrived. He was a man Mark had known for 20 years, someone who'd once toasted him at his promotion ceremony. Now, his face was lined with disbelief and pity. He spoke softly, telling Mark that he would be placed on leave while the investigation unfolded. The words barely registered. Mark just nodded. He felt numb, hollowed out, as though someone had reached inside and taken everything that made him who he was. When the officers finally cleared out and the last car pulled away, the house was silent again. The morning light spilled across the living room, revealing dust in the air that hadn't been visible before. Laura sat on the couch, motionless, eyes red and distant. She didn't ask questions. There were no words left that could make sense of what had happened. Mark wandered to the backyard, stopping near the edge of the woods. The grass was wet with dew, glistening under the weak sun. He could hear the faint hum of the highway far off in the distance, the sound of normal life continuing somewhere beyond reach. Everything he had built, his family, his career, his identity was gone, dismantled in a single night. In the following weeks, Brookdale would become a different town. People would talk in hushed voices about the detective who had turned in his own son. They would repeat the story like a legend, each version changing slightly but always ending the same way, with Mark Hensley sitting in silence as the world he knew fell apart. Some would call him brave, others broken, but for Mark there was no comfort in either word. He stopped wearing his badge, he stopped answering calls. Most nights, he would drive to the edge of town and park beneath the old street light near the woods, staring into the dark where the trees swallowed the horizon. It was the only place where he could breathe, the only place where the memories didn't feel so loud. And as the wind moved through the branches, carrying faint echoes of sirens and whispers of what had been, Mark knew there was no escaping what the truth had taken from him.